Merkensteijn, and I'm going to talk to y'all about when brains collide. So back in 10th grade, as El-Haj knows, I had a concussion playing soccer with a bunch of my friends, which really spurred the beginning of my interest in concussion and brain trauma and led to some research opportunities down the line. So I'm going to discuss not only sort of a summary and survey of the field of concussion research itself, but also I want to survey our culture here at BC and have a discussion about that. So just a little bit about me, myself, and I. I'm from New York. I went to collegiate with El-Haj. I'm a philosophy and medical humanities major and minor here. And for the past 4 years, every summer I've been going out to California to work at the Concussion and Brain Performance Clinic at Stanford. Additionally, here in Boston, there's a private company called SyncThink that manufactures medical devices that I've been involved with. And really into virtual reality, like was said, 3D printing quadcopters. And I was recently admitted to the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. So, big question to throw out there is, what exactly is concussion? Recently, the terminology has shifted from concussion to mild traumatic brain injury, and within the last 6 months has shifted to actually using something called ADD, which is not attention deficit disorder, but is acute disorientation disorder. So if you think of concussion along the lines of disorientation, that fuzzy, clouded feeling, I think that's a very good terminology to sort of get your mind around. So the issue with concussion is one of timing, prediction, and orientation. And recently there's also been a push to break down concussion from this overarching monolith into 5 subtypes. I've sort of coded them with color, but ocular, motor, and vestibular impairments, or impairments to your eyes and to your balance systems, are probably the 2 most profound. The ones we test for now generally revolve around cognitive failure, so anything to do with test taking where you've done problems on a computer screen and compared that to a previous score, that would be cognitive fatigue. And then structural damage and migraine come later down. So the research opportunity was under Dr. Jam Gajar, and we focus on smooth pursuit eye tracking, which basically is putting a target up on a screen at a predictable speed and having you follow it. And then we measure, using really tiny and very precise cameras, how well you're able to follow that target. And what this does is it gives us a sense of your ability to pay attention and how severely your ability to pay attention has been impaired. So basically it's a metric for that ocular motor impairment that concussion can bring about. The studies I've been involved with in the past 4 years are iTrack, which is just the baseline one. Next year was iTrack Advance, which revolved around 1,400 athletes, and eventually that spiraled into a big study, 10,000 people with 5,000 military members, 2,500 service members, and 2,500 civilian controls. So at SyncThink, we assess dynamic and static visual attention, which correlate to both vestibular and ocular motor, like I've said. What this means is simply that in a static situation, you and the world stay still, and you just follow the world with your eyes. So this would be the coach moving his finger and asking you to follow it. A dynamic situation would be like if we put you in a VR headset and had the world move and you had to follow that. And that's a good metric of how well you're able to maintain your balance and your vestibular system. So the state of concussion today is unfortunately one where there's a complete lack of consensus and definition. And bringing about consensus and definition is important to any cause. So I just want to spread the word to you guys and get it out there. But right now, some of the misconceptions at play include on the side of prevention, just the nature of football helmets. So a lot of people think that if we spend a lot of money, buy a $5,000 helmet for our players, that's really going to help them and they won't get concussions. But the reality is they're just as good as these leatherhead helmets from the 1920s. The only thing that a modern helmet will bring about is preventing a skull fracture or preventing some sort of severe TBI. But for concussion's sake, these 2 are equivalents and should not be thought of as any sort of tool that matters. On the recovery side, when I had my concussion, I was isolated, put by myself in a room due to sensitivity to light, inability to follow text when I was reading, inability to look at screens. And it was very dark and dank, like this lovely Google image. But the thought has now evolved, and people are really pushing to have people maintain their normal daily routines. So if you're a football player and you hit your head really bad, maybe you don't play contact practice, but you still go to those workout practices. You maintain your social group, and you maintain your general setting in life. And this has been found to be very helpful. The national state of concussion, 90% of all traumatic brain injuries are considered concussions. They're not the less severe side of the brain injury spectrum. And that accounts for 3.8 million people just in sports and recreation alone. So this is, if not someone you know or yourself, someone in the immediate bubble around you. On the college level, 33% of concussions occur during practices, and we measure concussion rates in athletic exposures. So an athletic exposure is any event, either play or practice, play being the actual game. And this is just a chart of a few different rates of athletic exposure concussion relations. You can see on top, football and hockey. Hockey is bad in particular because the people are falling further due to the height of their skates and their general height. And then there's a trickle down into other sports. Interestingly, a very aggressive sport, race car driving, has absolutely zero concussions, and we'll get into why that is later. But you would expect that in a situation where you're driving hundreds of miles an hour in thousands of pounds of car, that would cause some sort of brain injury. So this is important for later in the talk, but right now we have a situation where high school, middle school, pee-wee, and kids football, that pool is drying up. Parents aren't allowing their kids to play football anymore because it's perceived to be dangerous and detrimental to their future health, not only in the moment of the concussion, but also in things like CTE, and eventually into Alzheimer's dementia. So concussion research today. This is my survey of the field. The first thing is the Hans device. So this is why race car drivers sustain no concussions in average rates, because their heads are locked into their seats and they're not able to joggle their brains around. And research is currently being done to adapt that to football and the military through something called a G-brace, which would basically lock your neck into place and prevent that rattle and shake. On the testing side, this is probably where most of you are familiar with concussion, but if you've ever done a sport, a lot of sports programs are mandated to have you take these tests to compare as a baseline for if you hit your head eventually. So they're good, but they require self-comparison, and they take a long time, and that's not often viable in a field setting. Accelerometers, like in your iPhone, are starting to be implemented into helmets, into headbands, into sweatbands, stuff like that. But again, this is a metric of how hard you are being hit. So it is not a metric of how bad your concussion is. There's not a direct correlation between severity of hit and severity of head trauma. Those two are separate entities because there's a lot more dynamics at play than just simple force. But these are important for coaches to understand who's getting hit and why they're getting hit the hardest. Blood and biomarkers, there's various proteins that are secreted by the brain that you can assess if a concussion has occurred. But again, this equipment is very specialized, expensive, and really would only happen in a hospital setting, not on a sideline. EEG and EKG have moved from being specialist-only technician-operated machinery in a full-on hospital to something mobile that you can use, and this is very exciting. And then we come to the vestibular and balance boards. So people will have pressure sensors under their feet and will be asked to maintain a certain stance, and then variance in that stance will be measured and correlated to severity of head trauma. This is sometimes done in VR, like I said before, and sometimes the two are coupled together. This is really cool. I saw this for the first time about a month ago when I was down in Washington, D.C., but people from Notre Dame were trying to use voice modulation and speech patterns to assess severity of head trauma. Unfortunately, if you think about a football stadium setting, it's very loud and it's probably not viable for a sideline type situation. So then we get to eye tracking. This is what I care about. Talked about this before. But the really important point is the bottom one, where it's a functional measure of your brain in a given moment and how it is performing. So this tells us a lot about everything going on inside and is a good metric for trying to assess the severity of a head trauma. A typical eye tracking test, like I said, coach in the finger, or what we do, we use infrared cameras to look at how closely your pupil can follow a dot moving in a circle at a predictable speed, and then a saccade is just how much forward or behind you are from that dot. And we can correlate that not only to severity of head trauma, but also to things like just general sleep deprivation, being old, or being on certain substances. An important thing about eye tracking in particular is that accessibility is hugely increasing. So like what I said with the EEG and EKG, when I started at the Concussion and Brain Performance Clinic, we were using these dinosaur-sized devices that were one-offs and weren't part of the market that we were creating ourselves. Within a year, that shifted to an Oculus Rift-based platform, so consumer-grade something order of magnitude less expensive. And then this year we've shifted to a mobile VR platform, which again has gone from tens of thousands of dollars down to the thousands of dollars range. So in terms of people having access to the tools that they need to assess their head trauma, that's becoming much more prevalent and possible. So now I think we should talk about perhaps the price of football and sports in general, but particularly football, both in our culture in general as well as here at BC. So I think BC football culture, though I'm not a particularly huge fan of the sport, is a really beautiful thing because it brings together not only us as students, but alumni from past years as well as the families of those people. And I think that's something we should value and cherish. And if we look at the games that we have that are special one-off games, the Red Bandana game, the homecoming game, Parents Weekend, these are all really great things and I think essential to any given year any BC student ever has. If we look at our other sports, you still have the alumni family and students, and maybe there's the bean pod, maybe there are one-offs, but I don't think it's as ubiquitous or across the board. So these are important things to consider when we think about our future with sports. This is just a little analysis of how we've been spending our money at BC, but when we built Alumni Stadium in the 1970s, it cost about $350,000, which is about $3 million today. When we built Conti Forum, that was an order of magnitude more. And the new practice fields are an order of magnitude more than even that. If we think about the community members that these facilities serve, it's gone from 45,000 people, that is everyone at BC, to serving 8,000 for other sports, which is fine, to serving only a few hundred people in our expenditure. So this is, I think, perhaps backwards from what it could and should be, and is an important thing to think about. Additionally, at other schools, you have the problem of specific education, where special classes are set up just for sports players, and they don't actually receive a real education. They get an A, they go to practice, and that's it. There's preferential treatment not only between the athletes and non-athletes, but also among athlete classes, where some sports are preferenced above others in terms of resources. And there's some degree of amateur advantage taking. I know this issue's been addressed specifically, but I remember in 2014 when Shabazz Napier said that he was unable to eat before his final game. And I know that the NCAA has come forward and has addressed that specifically, but the point is not about food. The point is about the institutional advantage taking of these student athletes. And I think that though this all occurs at other schools, it also reflects on us here at BC. So when people talk about football as like a financial thing, right? Not only does that make the student not a student, but a source of income, which is wrong, it also is just completely invalid in that we make $20 million in a good season from the ACC. We've made about $140 million since 2005 when we were introduced into it. But that doesn't even cover the $200 million cost of the new facility. So you're running a net loss, and I don't think the financial argument flies. I think the hierarchy and preferential treatment is something I've experienced. So freshman year, as some people know here, I was on the crew team for all of 10 minutes, and during that time, I happened to break both my legs, and I was lucky enough that I could go to Conti Forum and get an x-ray done on campus. If I had gone 6 weeks later and broken both my legs then, when I was no longer on the crew team, I would have to go to St. Eve's or another like off-campus medical facility. So there is no quality of resources, and I think we should consider that as something important when we think about how campus health services are balanced with something like football health services. So really I just want to ask, how do we care for the BC athletes' brain and health and well-being going into the future while maintaining our sports culture in a responsible way? Because I think both facets are really important. And if we look to the past, 1984, Doug Flutie is sort of the initial marker on the map for BC. I think everyone talks about that. That's why we have a statue to him. And there's a really great quote by a Boston Globe author who said, "A bronze statue at Boston College honors the moment an undersized quarterback named Doug Flutie hurled a Hail Mary touchdown pass in 1984 that helped catapult his struggling and regional school to national prominence." We all know this. We also all know that CSOM is a great source of funding and reputation for the school. I think that was built largely off of the reputation of Doug Flutie. So I think when we ask, what's next and who are we going forward, we need to perhaps divest ourselves of these past notions and look to things that we've started to do, such as the new Schiller Institute is a great example of something BC can be in the future. I think if we had taken that $200 million that we were spending on new practice fields, we could have accommodated the nursing and pre-med students who want a med school associated with the school. We could take the comp sci students who want an engineering school, and we could have built that. We could take CSOM and build a graduate level program, but we're giving a couple hundred students new fields. And to me, that seems wrong. So I think if we ask, I think if we understand our standing in the collegiate space as being a sports school with good academics, we should ask ourselves why we can't be a great school with good sports. Thank you.